Imagine two countries, same rich world money, same educated population, same demand for a roof over your head. One of them builds so many homes that prices barely move for 30 years. The other builds so few that people are raising kids in spaces smaller than a parking spot. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which lever actually moves that needle. Spoiler, it's not the one every politician promises to pull. Number 8. Japan. Since the 1960s, Tokyo's housing supply has nearly tripled. Over that same stretch, London, New York and Paris, cities with just as much money and just as much demand, grew their housing supply by only 20 to 30%. And here's the part that actually gets me. In a lot of Japan, homes lose value over time. Not, prices grow slower than you'd like. They actually go down, the way a car does, year after year. How they pulled this off is almost embarrassingly simple. Back in 1968, Japan passed one national zoning law for the whole country, with just 12 zoning categories total. 12. Compare that to the hundreds of overlapping categories a typical American city juggles across dozens of competing local governments. Almost every zone allows housing, and neighbors mostly can't block a project just because they don't like it, as long as it follows the rules. If housing is the biggest financial stress in your life, my house is worth less next year, and that's fine, should sound almost impossible. That's how differently this can go. Supporters say it's the clearest real-world proof of what happens when a country makes it easy to build. Critics point out real trade-offs: less protection for older buildings, more visual mess block to block, and a demographic assist too, since Japan's population isn't growing the way, say, Canada's is. We don't know exactly how much of this comes from zoning versus demographics, but South Korea has almost identical demographic pressure, and its home prices remain brutally out of reach. Same population story, opposite housing outcome. That's a pretty strong hint the zoning part is doing real work. Hang on to that thread. It comes back at the end. Because if you thought homes that lose value was the wildest thing you'd hear today, wait until you see what happens when a country does the exact opposite of everything Japan just did. Number 7. Hong Kong. One of the richest cities per person on the planet still hasn't figured out basic living space. Roughly 220,000 people in Hong Kong live in what the government itself calls subdivided flats. Apartments carved up into smaller and smaller pieces, some averaging under 50 square feet of space per person. 50 square feet, that's roughly a king-size mattress with just enough space left over to open the door without hitting it. Not a room with a bed in it. The mattress is basically the room. Some of the most extreme cases, so-called cage homes, are metal-framed sleeping compartments stacked on top of each other, about the size of a single bed, where people can't even fully stand up. Here's the number that really puts it in perspective. The average Hong Kong resident, and this isn't even counting the subdivided flat population, lives with about 161 square feet of personal space. That's roughly the size of a parking spot. Meanwhile, only around a quarter of Hong Kong's land has ever been developed. The rest sits as protected parks and untouched hillside, in one of the tightest housing markets on Earth. If you've ever felt cramped in a small studio apartment, picture a family of 3 living, sleeping and doing homework in a third of that space, permanently, because that's the unit they can afford. That's not a hypothetical. That's Tuesday for about 1/5 of a million people in one of the wealthiest cities on the planet. Defenders point out Hong Kong has expanded public housing waitlists and passed new rules requiring a toilet and a minimum floor space for subdivided units. Critics point to the deeper issue. A large share of land that could technically be built on has sat unreleased for years, even as the shortage got worse. This isn't a story about running out of physical space. It's a story about how much of that space was ever allowed to be built on. So, Japan, homes that lose value because there's too much supply. Hong Kong, homes the size of a parking space because there's almost none. Same underlying issue, 2 opposite endpoints. Now here's a country that watched itself move from one direction toward the other, in real time, almost like a live experiment. Number 6. New Zealand. You'd expect a mid-sized country like New Zealand to be a footnote in a global housing conversation. Instead, Auckland just ran what might be the best real-world test anywhere on Earth. In 2016, Auckland did something almost no city had tried at this scale before. It loosened building rules on roughly 3/4 of its residential land in one go, tripling, by some estimates, increasing by over 300%, the amount of housing legally allowed on that land. Not a subsidy, not a grant program, just, you're now allowed to build more. Researchers have studied this like a natural experiment, comparing the areas where rules loosened against similar nearby areas that didn't. Construction surged. By 2022, Auckland hit a record high for new homes approved per resident, and rents told the same story. Between 2016 and 2023, Auckland's rents rose by roughly 20%, well below the growth in Wellington and Tauranga over that same stretch. By 2023, for the first time in a generation, Auckland's housing supply actually caught up with and started outpacing population growth. Not everyone agrees on exactly how much of that slower growth to credit to the policy versus other factors, but almost everyone agrees on the direction. More room to build, more homes got built, rents cooled where others didn't. That's about as close to real proof as this topic ever gets. Picture being a renter in Auckland in 2016, assuming this was just another well-meaning policy that changes nothing. Then watching apartment buildings go up on your own street within a few years, on land that legally couldn't have held them before. Supporters point to Auckland as proof that loosening building rules works even in a single mid-sized city, not just a giant like Tokyo. Critics note the change also shifted what got built. More small apartments, fewer larger family homes. A fair trade-off worth watching, even if it doesn't undercut the core result. So Auckland proved the fix works with one policy change. Next, a country that proves the same point, a completely different way. Not by loosening anything, but by having the government build the homes itself. Number 5. Singapore. A country where the government owns most of the land and builds most of the housing sounds like the textbook case of a subsidy solution. Instead, look closer, and Singapore's real story isn't the subsidy, it's that its housing board has simply built over 1 million homes since 1960. Enough that today somewhere around 3/4 to 4/5 of Singapore's population lives in one. That's most of an entire country living in homes the government itself built, with around 90% of those residents owning their unit, including the majority of Singapore's lowest income households. That should catch you off guard, because we usually assume government-run housing means long wait lists and run-down buildings. Here, it means one of the highest homeownership rates on the planet. Critics point out the cost is real. Housing takes up a huge slice of Singapore's spending, but supporters would say that's the whole point. It's expensive because it actually built enough homes for most of the country, not because it handed out money for a supply that never showed up. 4 countries in, and you've already seen too much supply, too little supply, deregulation, and direct government building. 4 different paths, all landing in the same place. More homes got built. Now let's look at 4 countries that took a very different path and see where it left them. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more people discover our work and supports us in creating more videos like this. A great deal of time and research goes into every episode, and we truly appreciate your support. Now let's get back to it. Number 4, the United Kingdom. You would expect London, one of the most expensive, most in-demand cities on the planet, to be building up and out as fast as it possibly can. Instead, there's a ring of protected countryside around it that's barely changed in 50 years, no matter how bad the housing crunch gets. It's called the Green Belt, and the idea behind it is simple. Draw a line around a city and tell everyone inside that line that development stops there. Nearly a quarter of outer London is Green Belt land, and in some boroughs it's over half. Here's the number that really lands. Over the past decade, barely more than 1% of London region Greenbelt land was ever released for development. 1%. London's own planning inspectors say the city needs roughly 50,000 new homes a year, and it's been falling short for years running. And this isn't all picturesque, actively farmed countryside. A lot of it isn't scenic at all. One free market think tank has argued that releasing just the land within a 10-minute walk of a train station could unlock enough for 1 million homes. Whether that number holds up is disputed, but even skeptics agree the policy keeps a lot of walkable, well-connected land completely off the table. Now picture living this. You're renting out in Zone 4, watching your rent eat over half your paycheck, driving past land you can see as empty, land that by law can never become your home. That's not an abstraction. That's your actual Monday. Defenders of the Green Belt say it prevents sprawl and preserves real green space for everyone, not just homeowners. Critics say a policy literally named for stopping growth is, unsurprisingly, extremely good at stopping growth, including the kind people badly need. You've probably heard some version of London's housing crisis before. This is what's actually behind the headline. But the next country runs almost the identical playbook, just with a very different reputation attached to it. Number 3, the United States. The biggest, most dynamic economy on Earth still hasn't figured out how to build houses. Huge parts of American cities have made it almost illegal to build anything but a single detached house with a yard. It comes down to something called single-family zoning, and it's not some fringe rule. It's the default. Roughly 3/4 of residential land in American cities is zoned exclusively for detached single-family homes, not duplexes, not small apartment buildings. One house, one lot, and in a lot of suburbs, that lot has to be at least a quarter acre, sometimes a full acre, before you're even allowed to build. And here's the part that should surprise you. Even when a developer wants to build something denser that's totally within the rules, a public hearing can let a handful of neighbors kill the project anyway. So picture this. You're 32, you've got a stable job, decent savings, you're doing everything right, and you still can't find a starter home within an hour of your job, because that category of home was basically written out of existence in your zip code decades before you were born. That's not bad luck, that's policy. Supporters say single-family zoning protects neighborhood character and property values. And to be fair, that's exactly what it was designed to do. Critics point out that protecting property values for existing owners is functionally the same thing as blocking new owners from ever getting in. Restrictive rules in the UK, restrictive rules in the US. Two countries, same instinct. Next, a country that took that exact same instinct and stacked something else right on top of it, making things worse instead of better. Number 2, Canada. Canada has more land per person than almost anywhere on Earth. It also has one of the worst housing crises in the developed world. For the last decade, it's sat near the top of every least affordable ranking out there. There's no single law behind this. It's more of a pattern. A wave of demand-side help, first-time buyer incentives, down payment assistance, tax credits, layered on top of restrictive local zoning that never really got touched. Toronto and Vancouver, especially, kept a lot of the same single-family dominant rules from the US segment, while demand kept climbing. To be clear, immigration itself isn't the problem here. The problem is that construction never scaled up to match it. Canada took in immigration at some of the highest per-person rates in the developed world over the past several years. A huge economic asset, but new home completions didn't come close to keeping pace with population growth in its biggest cities. That's like adding a whole extra bus's worth of passengers at every stop and never adding a second bus. The buses are the problem, not the passengers. And if you're a young Canadian right now, get a good job and save for a down payment. The whole deal you were promised has quietly turned into a punchline in a lot of major cities. That's real lost trust, not just a rough patch. Supporters of the subsidy-heavy approach say it makes homeownership reachable for families who'd otherwise be shut out entirely. Critics point out something almost mechanical. Give buyers more money to spend without adding more homes for them to spend it on, and prices just absorb it. The same homes, chased by bigger budgets, just get more expensive to match. So far, every country that stacked subsidies on top of restriction has made things worse, not better. There's one country left, and it's the one that should make you the most uneasy, because on paper, it's doing almost everything right. Number 1, Germany. You'd expect Germany, a country famous for some of the strongest renter protections on Earth, to have solved affordability through sheer tenant friendliness alone. Instead, asking rents for new leases in Berlin have jumped roughly 70% since 2014, while incomes grew only around 32%. And by some recent estimates, the country as a whole is short somewhere between 550,000 and 700,000 homes. People usually point to Germany's rent control style system. Increases on existing leases are capped and tied closely to local benchmarks, and tenants get long secure leases that are hard for landlords to end. And it protects existing renters well, but that protection only covers people who already have a lease. Building enough units for the renters who don't have one yet is a completely different problem, and Germany is losing that one. Building permits nationally hit their lowest level in 15 years in 2024. The government's own housing agency estimates the country needs around 320,000 new homes a year. Actual completions have been running closer to 260,000 to 295,000. Construction in fast-growing German cities has lagged well behind population and household growth in recent years, especially as more people move toward the same handful of major cities. Think of it like this. A great tenant protection law is like a genuinely fair lottery. Well run, nobody's cheating. But if there still aren't enough tickets to go around, fairness doesn't get you a home. Some Berlin renters spend years on wait lists for the very units this system is supposed to protect. Supporters argue Germany's model is still far more humane than a pure free market, since existing tenants aren't at the mercy of sudden rent spikes. Critics argue that strong tenant protections without matching construction just move the shortage somewhere else. Instead of high prices, you get years-long wait lists and renters terrified to ever move, since giving up a protected lease might mean never finding another one. And that's the one that should really get you, because Germany isn't the villain here. It didn't ban growth like the UK. It didn't stack subsidies on top of restriction like Canada. It built one of the fairest tenant systems on Earth, and it still couldn't outrun a construction gap. If even the country doing the most right thing on paper can't escape this, that tells you something about what was actually driving this the whole time. Okay, quick recap, because you earned it. Japan, homes that lose value because there's so much supply. Hong Kong, homes the size of a parking spot because there's almost none. New Zealand, Proved the fix works with one policy change. Singapore proved it again by building the homes directly instead. The UK and the US both banned their way into a shortage. Canada stacked subsidies on top of that same shortage and made it worse. And Germany, the country that did almost everything else right and still couldn't outbuild its own population growth. Here's the thing that took me way too long to notice, going through all this. Singapore and New Zealand landed on almost opposite instincts. One government built over 1 million homes directly. The other just got out of the way and let private developers build. Completely different philosophies, and yet both ended up in basically the same place. Meaningfully more homes actually got built. Meanwhile, the UK and Canada landed on the same instinct as each other: protect what's already built, help the buyer instead, and got the same disappointing result twice. Still not enough homes, prices still climbing. And I don't mean subsidies are useless. Plenty of the countries we covered pair subsidies with real supply reform, and that works fine. The point is narrower. A subsidy without more homes to spend it on just hands buyers a bigger budget to chase the same small pile of houses, and prices rise to match. Zoning and land use restriction is the biggest force behind unaffordability almost everywhere we looked, not the money a government spends, and as Germany just showed, not even how fairly it treats the renters already in the system. So, if you had to bet on just one thing a country could do to actually fix housing, would you bet on more subsidies, or more legal room to build? Because 8 countries just showed you their answer, whether they meant to or not. Drop your answer below, subsidies or supply, and tell me which country surprised you most. And if there's a system you want broken down like this next, put it in the comments. Until next time, on Comparison Explained.